Hey everyone, building on the theme of archival power, this week we are looking at archival silence and how powerful archival silences can be. We have two very different readings for this week, kind of like the Cook and the Strippist article, the algorithmic culture article a couple weeks ago. One author writes very much in the same vein as Cook, who we've been reading about, so it will seem very familiar. The other author, Saidiya Hartman, gives us a whole different kind of writing. She's an actual writer, so her article is much more literary than we're normally reading in this class. And it's a little bit of a challenge in a creative, artistic way. I think one that will be very fun. Much better than a challenge in terms of a dense, obtuse, academic kind of way. So I'll say more about these two in a second. So very different articles that I think make an interesting pair. You also have a different kind of assignment this week, a weekly reflection kind of thing, but a little different, where you're looking at your archival silences. I'll get to that at the end. Our first article from Rodney Carter, Of Things Said and Unsaid, Power and Archival Silences. He's another insightful Canadian academic archivist in the vein of Terry Cook, who we've been reading. He's really picking up where Terry Cook leaves off in terms of power, obviously interested in how we should think about archival silences. The article that we're reading, it's a little bit more repetitious than maybe it could be. Just a quick warning, don't tune out when you see the same thing kind of repeated multiple times. It's not the best writing in my opinion, but still very useful and makes a lot of really good points in a relatively short space. So I think it's really nice in that way. The main and most obvious point is this: silences are, in part, the manifestation of the actions of the powerful, meaning archivists as people in power of creating archives and therefore creating a sense of the past that reflects and maybe justifies their own power, in denying the marginal, meaning people outside the mainstream groups in society, the less powerful, access to archives. Okay? Silences are the manifestations of the actions of the powerful in denying the marginal access to archives and the power that comes from archives that we read about last week. Okay? Carter argues that this denial, these silences, have a significant impact on the ability of marginal groups to form social memory, history, and to some extent identity. I think we should question whether or not being in the mainstream or being one of these marginal groups really matters for these groups. Aren't they kind of managing their own histories and identities? I mean, do they really need somebody else's archive to be a part of, to have their own cultural memory and so on? It's easy to say, no, they can do their own thing. But here's why the silences are very important. In my view, the power of archives and of archival silence is not just about the power of collective memory. It's about how power from archives forms a basis for social, political, legal relationships. When one group is absent or misrepresented in the archive, the space of the archive further reifies the power of those who have created the archive at the expense of people who are not in it. So if power is derived from heritage and legacy and the authority of archival documentation, which it unquestionably is, then being absent from the archive and the discourse of history is a big disadvantage. You don't have the same legitimacy to participate in those social, political, and legal relationships. Carter makes a very important point that there is a dire problem of non-responsiveness in the archives to marginal and indigenous epistemologies, or ways of knowing the world. The marginal communities, and he says marginal not in a judgmental way, but sort of marginal meaning on the outside or the periphery of archives, if in at all, the marginal that do not adopt the Western frame of reference are ignored. And this is to say that people who have different ways of looking at the world, people have a different kind of knowledge system, people who might label their own folders differently, gets excluded. How do we counter silences in the archive? One idea is to collect more stuff, have a more open mind about what should go in an archive, find more creative ways to catalog. A couple problems with the idea that we should just collect more. I do think we should collect more. We should have a more open mind about archives. but a couple things to keep in mind as we gather more stuff. One idea that I found very hard to understand, not from this article, but when I first got introduced to this idea, is that some people value histories and wisdom and knowledge in a way that they find it anathema or forbidden, that knowledge should be inscripted or written down and archived. It's just sacrilegious. So some information is highly privileged by certain cultures, and it's so highly valued that it's shared and controlled and spread and possessed and not known in certain ways that to write it down is to completely disrespect it. Now, personally, I'm someone who loves documentary order and authority, okay? That's me. I worked in IT for a number of years, database architecture, application development. It's all about information storage and retrieval in one form or another, lots of different forms. My default setting, if I'm thinking back through my own consciousness, is to have everything ordered, available, findable, accessible. I don't know if that can be hardwired in a brain, like, just like the neurons are set to think in that way. But I've certainly trained myself to think along those lines. So it was very difficult for me to get my head around the idea that knowledge, ideas that are most treasured and most sacred must not be archived. And the fact is that many cultural groups around the world, many indigenous communities in the United States have knowledge, folklore, myths, histories, whatever you want to call them, that would be completely defiled if written down. So for me, learning about these people who valued knowledge and archives in very different ways, this completely exploded the idea of an archive for me. And I don't mean eliminate or destroy, but just made it infinitely more complicated. So I didn't appreciate how total the hegemony of the Western archival model had sort of lodged itself in my brain. My idea of an archive was one particular version of an archive, and it just seemed to me the archive. Like everybody, of course, has the same kind of archive. You put stuff in or you don't. And it worked the same way. And to learn about different cultures, different communities having their own versions of archives, their own versions of ways of seeing the world that don't fit into these other kinds of archives, really makes you question why we do things the way we do, right? I think one reason, in retrospect, thinking, well, how did I come up with this idea? One reason maybe in this country, in the United States, that documentary authority is so strong is because the country is literally built on, well, it's not literally built, but figuratively built on the history and sometimes mythology of famous documents. Magna Carta, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, Constitution. Our identity / history as a nation, our imagined community, is built on documentary authority, right? Especially the Constitution. If you aren't part of that group that's in the archive, if you're not part of that documentary authority, you don't have any authority. Again, going back to these political and legal and social relationships defined through archives. So collecting more isn't always possible or desirable in the case of people who don't want certain things written down and archived. Another problem with the let's add more voices approach to countering silences is that the archivist inadvertently can really distort what's going in. All right, we talked about sort of selection and appraisal and so on in previous articles, and we need to keep that in mind here as well. There's a real danger that anytime any sort of underrepresented or marginal group, anytime anything from that culture is going into an archive that's from a different culture, is going to be biased or distorted through the process of creation. So as a result of misinterpretation or misunderstanding, due to the subjectivity or misunderstanding of the archivist and the archive may be working to the detriment of the marginal group they're trying to help, right? So putting a square peg in a round hole is a phrase that comes to mind here. How do you accommodate a very different way of thinking about the world, different social structures, different cultural values? How do you put those things in an archive that's designed to promote a very different set of cultural values and social structures? there's going to be some distortion to get things to fit in. And that's where that danger of misrepresentation becomes prominent, a problem that we have to be thinking about. And a good example that Carter mentions is oral histories. Now, I've always thought as oral histories as a great thing to put in archive. You get somebody talking about their community and their history and their identity, and that goes in the archive in their voice. It's not being, thrust upon them by some historian that therefore goes in the archive. It's really about the person. And this is how can this be complicated? Carter asks a very profound question, I think, that's quite hard to answer. Who do oral histories really serve? Is it the person giving the oral history and that community? Or is it the person capturing it and the archive that it's going to be in? Who's really benefiting? Clearly, it can be seen to benefit everybody in slightly different ways, but there's real tensions there between who benefits, who owns that, who accesses it, who controls it going into the future. Cook also draws attention to sites of marginalization, where the state imposes its will and forces itself onto the populace. And he highlights in particular prisons, hospitals, mental institutions, residential schools, ghettos, concentration camps, to give a pretty extreme example. And indeed, often the only extant historical information on these persecuted minorities that go into these places, especially the poor, are found in the records created by the state and the apparatus that marginalizes and subjugates them. So the only way we know about certain people is because the state is controlling them. And so everything we know about them is one very limited perspective. This is another important point that will figure into the data algorithm part of the class. I just added a link to the syllabus for this week, a short blog post about an initiative to archive exactly these kinds of voices surrounding the mass incarceration in Los Angeles, recording the voices of these people who are being subject to the apparatus of the state. And how do we understand their view of what's happening? How historians later can go back and look and understand our society by getting their voices. It's going to be a pretty tremendous archive. So I thought that just came across my desk a few days ago, so I thought it was perfectly timely to throw in. It's very short, so you can just skim through it and you get the idea. So Carter challenges us to think about the power of silence. He also reminds us that silence must not be equated with absence, because silence can be a forceful strategy of resistance, refusing to be part of somebody else's archive. I'm interested to hear if you agree with this or not. He also says resistance need not be recognized by the powerful for it to be an assertion of power by the marginal. And actually, I'm not so sure about this, because how can a historian going into an archive differentiate deliberately empowering silences, meaning when someone has deliberately refused to participate in an archive? How can they differentiate that from suppressive silences where people were deliberately excluded against their will? How do you know why they're not there? It seems like you need some indicator that the silence is deliberate, that the silence is an act of resistance. Carter seems to think that the silence is going to be powerful regardless. I'm not sure that's the case. Maybe you'll write about that a little bit. At the end of the day, Carter gives us a lot of interesting ways to think about silences. And one big picture point to take away here is to appreciate the different kinds of silences that he's describing. There are silences to respect, like an assertion of power, or simply a different view of the world that hasn't been incorporated into an archive. Those are silences to respect. And there are silences to correct, this unnatural silences of the marginalized groups that have been deliberately excluded. And silences that are created to avoid culpability, so that it's impossible to hold the powerful accountable for their actions. And this is where the sort of the mass incarceration in Los Angeles project is trying to think about, is sort of, we get the state's view of these criminals and why they need to be in jail. But we don't get the experience of these people who are subject to things that most people might agree aren't so great. So let's get their voices to hold power accountable. So these kinds of silence can be combated by the archivist. And of course, this project I'm alluding to is exactly this effort to counter that kind of silence, which has been typical in the traditional archive. Our second article is from Saidiya Hartman, and as I mentioned, one of our more creative reads for this semester. Hartman is a writer and professor of literature, working primarily in African American and American literature and cultural history with an emphasis on slavery. And these all get wrapped up into the article that we're reading for this week. In her article, she's talking about a particular kind of silence, an archetypal silence, in terms of African narratives of captivity and enslavement. In her two previous books on slavery, she pioneered what she calls a critical fabulation approach, combining archival research, critical theory, and fictional narrative to explore the afterlife of slavery and the effects of racism and exile on African American identity. In the article we're reading, she talks about something she didn't put in one of her earlier books because she didn't know how. And she's exploring this sort of thought process she had about how can she write about certain things that she sees in the historical record and things she doesn't see. How can she make these come to life in modern literature? So one question she struggles with in her work is representing silences in archives, which is why I think these articles are a great pair. She says that to read the archive is to enter a mortuary. It permits one final viewing and allows for one last glimpse of persons about to disappear into the slavehold. So we've read a lot about archives in general, sort of an abstract, theoretical way. And Hartman sees using the archive as almost an emotional experience, right? So consider being in the archive. You're looking over a bureaucratic document about a slave ship, and it's going to talk about the number of sailors that are on it, how much it costs for the voyage, the cargo, the people they're transporting. It's economics. This is very bureaucratic. And then you see the name, you see a list of names of an African captured by force and listed as cargo. In a sense, that person, that was an actual human being, has no existence, either historical or future existence, outside of that one line on that one document. But looking at that document sort of makes them alive. When you read that person's name, they're alive in your imagination, right? You're seeing this person in a way. What kind of responsibility does that create? If you want to tell a story about slavery and enslaved people, what can you say about them that's really their voice? How can anyone fill that kind of silence? To echo a quote in the article, how do you respect the limits of what cannot be known? How can you still tell the story you feel you need to tell? It's a different kind of writing, for sure. Just keep reading. You'll get lost at times. It gets very abstract. You're like, who is this person? What are they talking about? Just keep reading. It always comes back to something concrete. It always comes back to a document, and then it kind of goes out and gets a little bit more speculative, and then it comes back to the document. This is the way I think she sees herself working in an archive. This is very iterative approach of building out from a document and imagining a world, but then coming back again to the archive. So just keep reading, and it will work. It will work. It's kind of like a roller coaster. I could describe it to you, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you go on, and you're like, oh, now I get it. So just keep reading. Your assignment for this week is a little different than our standard weekly reflections. Nice to mix things up, be a little bit more creative once in a while. I've written up all the instructions on a guidelines page. It's linked to under the Friday day on the syllabus. I thought it'd be helpful to explain it a little bit here. There's two parts to your assignment. Each are going to be about 400 to 500 words. So about the same length as a weekly reflection. You might use a little bit more space for this one, but it should be easier writing in many ways. The first part, you're going to write about your experience with Hartman. What did you take away from her article? What did you like? What did you dislike? What quotes or ideas resonated with you, even if you didn't understand them? What just kind of got you thinking? And did you think it was useful in terms of thinking about imagination and archival silence? So that's the first part. The second part, again, another 400 to 500 words, is to analyze the archival silences of your own photo archive. like on your phone or wherever you keep photos. The last 6 months, year, whatever. Pick at least a couple months so you have a range of stuff to look through. The pandemic has made our photo archives look a lot different than they might normally, right? There's a lot less friends and family and stuff in our photos than there normally would be. That's okay. You can ignore that fact and just and use what you have. You can go back in time and look at just 2019 if you want to just focus on that. That's fine. The time range really doesn't matter, but just have enough there that you have a sample to draw from. So usually in an archive, you can't know what's not in front of you, right? I mean, you might have a hint that something isn't there, but you're really limited to whatever shows up in front of you. But here, analyzing your own photo archive, you know what's not in there, right? Because you lived your life. You know what you didn't take pictures of. You might have to think about it a little bit, but you can really do an analysis of these silences that you can't normally do in an archive. So the question is to describe, what don't you take pictures of? What about you and your interests in your life are not represented in your archive? I think the key question is this. If someone who didn't know you, say a historian 200 years from now, looking through your photos, right, because they're all in the cloud so they can just look at them, what would they miss? How do the silences in your archive misrepresent who you are? Or in fact, represent you quite well? Make sure you're talking about silences. It's easy to fall in the trap of describing what is in front of you. Your cat, dog, kid, favorite hike, food. Make sure you're talking about things that aren't there. Okay? You'll probably want to describe a little bit about what is there in order to contrast it to stuff that's not. But remember, the focus is on the silences. One last caveat, write what you feel comfortable writing about. Okay, you don't have to bare your soul in these blog posts here. You can decide to leave something out because you just don't feel comfortable sharing it. No one's going to know. No one's going to care. It's fine. This is supposed to be fun, not create some sort of anxiety about personal sharing of information here. You can analyze a lot of very mundane silences in very profound ways. So if in doubt, leave it out. Okay. But I think there's a lot of fun to be had in analyzing our silences without feeling like we're revealing too much, okay? I look forward to your posts. I hope you enjoy the theme for the week and the readings. Take care.